Welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name's Michael Anderson and I'm a member of the Longevity and Mortality Actuaries member interest group who are putting on the webinar today. The topic we're going to be considering is the issue of missing data and data that we don't know about and how that can mislead us when we're trying to form conclusions and develop assumptions. The idea for this webinar was prompted by the work that I'm sure many of us are doing in trying to understand the mortality experience that we've seen in 2022 and what the drivers behind those excess deaths might be. And it's trying to serve as a reminder that what is the apparent obvious cause may not really be what's going on, and we have to look at things a lot more carefully. Alan Greenspan once famously said that I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. And I wonder how many of our data sets that we use in our work would be telling us the same thing if they could. And to try and delve into these issues more deeply and get a better understanding, and so to help us avoid some of the main pitfalls, I'm delighted to say that today we're joined by Professor David Hand, who's the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics and Senior Research Investigator at Imperial College in London. He's also a former President of the Royal Statistical Society and a Fellow of the British Academy. Professor Hand is also a best-selling author. One of his books is called Dark Data, which deals with these topics specifically, but he's also written others, including the Improbability principle, and another Statistics, a very short introduction, as well as the Well-being of Nations and Principles of Data Mining. The format of today's webinar is going to be a presentation to begin with, to cover some of the main issues, and then we'll have some question and answers with a discussion between myself and Professor Hand to start things off. And then if you have questions, I would love to address those as well. If you could post those in the chat as we go along, that would be really helpful. And then we can work through those in the later stages of this webinar. Just so that everybody's aware, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be made available afterwards as well. So without further ado, over to Professor David Hand to share his thoughts on some of the pitfalls and perils of missing data.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a superb introduction to the topic of dark data at the beginning, a very nice introduction. I shall steal some of the sort of phrases that you used there. Let me kick off just by trying to share my screen. You should now see my title page, which has got the title of the talk and my name and Imperial College. Can you see it okay?
Yes, that's coming through perfect.
Okay, that's great. I should say that this talk is really about dark data in general, rather than the COVID pandemic and excess mortality and so on, although I do sort of focus on that to some extent, but it is broader. It's based on my book, which is called Dark Data, Why What You Don't Know Matters. And I'm going to tell you some of the things in that book, but go beyond it as well. So let me begin by, in some sense, paraphrasing what Michael said. My aim today is to urge caution and to point out that sometimes what you think is the obvious explanation for the structure in a data set might not be the right explanation. And the reason for that I'm focusing on today is because there is a misunderstanding, perhaps, of what data are relevant to what you're trying to understand. And in particular, I'm here because Michael saw me give a more elaborate presentation about the book. There's the front cover of the book, Dark Data, Why What You Don't Know Matters. This book describes the challenge of missing data, overlooked data, misunderstood data, incorrect data, misrecorded data, poorly defined data, and so on. And it looks at all different aspects of that. And I'm going to say a little bit more about what's in the book right at the end. So let me kick off by saying what I mean by dark data. And I could define it here, but instead of that, to make it more entertaining, I'm going to give you a couple of illustrative examples. The first example is one that I think you'll be familiar with. It's a little anecdote. You're walking down the road and you come across an elderly man putting little piles of powder down the center of the road. And you ask him what he's doing. And he says, it's elephant powder. It's to keep the elephants away. And you say, but there are no elephants here. And he says, yes, it's wonderfully effective, isn't it? Of course, what he's missing is crucial information, crucial data on what would happen if he didn't put the elephant powder down. He might discover that that was equally effective at keeping the elephants away, or he might then go on to discover that there were no elephants to be kept away. The point there is that he's missing something crucial, some crucial information, some crucial data about the phenomenon he's trying to understand, and it's misleading him. He's drawing misleading conclusions. A little story, a little anecdote. Here's another story, a true story this time, which has exactly the same mathematical structure as the elephant powder example, but much more serious consequences. Around the year 1985, about 1.2 million people around the world per year died of measles. Thanks to the modern medical miracle of vaccination, that's now shrunk to about 100,000 a year dying of measles around the world. In fact, since the turn of the century, about 25 million lives have been saved, people who would have died of measles but haven't because of the vaccination. Actually, it's far worse than that now, far bigger than that, the impact. It's recently been discovered that measles damages the immune system. Think long COVID, for example. Measles damages the immune system, and it's thought that about 4 times as many people die of other diseases caused by damage to the immune system from measles than of measles itself. So we're really talking about 125 million lives saved since the turn of the century because of measles vaccination. But now put yourself in the position of a parent of a young child. This parent might legitimately say, nobody I know has died of measles, only 100,000 around the world. Nobody I know has died of measles, none of my friends, workmates, colleagues, family, nobody I know has died of measles. None of my child's friends have died of measles. So I think the danger is exaggerated. You can see that this is exactly the same sort of structure as the elephant powder example. They're missing crucial information, crucial data on what happens if people don't take the measles vaccine. In both cases, they are drawing mistaken conclusions because they're missing crucial information. In fact, funnily enough, just a week or two ago in this context, this thing appeared in the Times. Helen Bedford, Professor of Children's Health at University College London, said there were many reasons for the declining rate of childhood immunisation. Complacency was one of them. Parents were busy, thought of diseases as quite a remote threat, like my measles example, and so on. So my story is not too fanciful. Okay, dark data can arise for many reasons. Perhaps you really want today's data, but all you have is yesterday's. Not an uncommon situation, of course. You can't get future data, for instance. Perhaps your sample's distorted. Perhaps some cases are missing. Perhaps the data are inaccurate or rounded. And we all know that most measurements are imperfect, even counting measurements. Perhaps the data are available, but nobody's looked at them. They were just collected because of this sort of strategy of collecting all the data you can now, and they've been put into a database and data warehouse, and nobody's looked at them. In fact, Gartner has a definition of dark data which refers to just this particular kind. Perhaps you're really interested in data you would have collected had you done something else. Think of the elephant powder man, for example, or perhaps, and all sorts of other reasons. I'm going to give you some more examples. Let's look at dark data arising from missing variables. This is where you fail to record a crucial variable. And this is a simple little example which you might have come across. The orange line shows the proportion of people dying after their second vaccination against COVID. These are COVID. See, I haven't written COVID anywhere there. These are COVID death rates between March 2021 and August of that year. And the blue line shows you the death rates amongst the unvaccinated. Clearly, this shows that being vaccinated is more dangerous. More people are dying after being vaccinated than if they're not vaccinated. But when we take account of the dark data, the fact that different age groups, there was a different uptake between different age groups, partly because of the way the vaccine was rolled out to different age groups, and there's a different background death rate between age groups, obviously, then the picture inverts. So there are missing variables here which are crucial to what's going on. Dark data can also arise from different definitions. So here's a little example. Infant mortality rate is typically recorded as the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. So here are some IMRs from the year 2020. United States 5.44, look at the bottom one, Japan 1.82. And the question obviously arises, why is the infant mortality rate in Japan so poor? Is it such a backward country or what? Well, the answer is that there are differences in the way IMR is defined. And I've got the references at the bottom of the slides here so that you can see them afterwards if you want to hunt these things down. The United States Center for Disease Control, CDC, defines infant death as any death of an infant that takes place between the start of a pregnancy through to the first birthday. Quite a long range, in contrast to the WHO, which includes only those who die during pregnancy or the first 42 days, a different range. And moreover, some countries don't consider a child an infant until birth, so they don't include deaths that occur during pregnancy. So we've got three different definitions for IMR, infant mortality rate here, so no wonder the numbers are different. They're not comparable. We've got crucially missing data from each of the numbers because of the way the definitions are made. Here's another little example, also involving definitions. The rate of heart disease in Japan versus that in the US. So I'm going to be talking about rate of heart disease amongst males per 100,000 people per year. And in Japan, it's around 30, and in the US, it's 3 times as many. Actually, I should sort of parenthetically remark here that different sources give different values. They all go in the same direction as as the numbers I'm about to give you, the example I'm about to give you, but the precise numbers differ. But again, I've given the references. So anyway, heart disease in Japan is only a third of that in the US. So let's look at why this might be. Let's look at some of the risk factors. Well, smoking is not good news if you for heart attacks. But this is curious, isn't it? When these data were collected, twice as many men smoked in Japan. The proportion was twice as large in Japan as in the US. So this risk factor is going in the contrary direction from what we'd expect, judging by the heart disease rates. Another risk factor is systolic blood pressure. Again, high is bad news. Not much higher in Japan than in the US, but higher, which is, again, the contrary direction to what we'd expect. And then cholesterol level, similar. Now, obviously, these three risk factors are likely to be correlated, but even so, they're painting a very curious picture. We would expect the US heart disease rate to be lower than that in Japan, but it's not. So how can we explain this apparent contradiction, this anomaly? Well, we all know an explanation. It's because the Japanese have a diet which has a high proportion of fish, which contains a substance called omega-3, which is an oil which is known to be protective against heart attacks. So that's a possible explanation. But now consider this. In Japan, heart attacks are a low status disease. They're regarded as associated with manual labor, like digging roads and so on. In contrast, strokes are a high status disease in Japan. They imply the sort of things you guys do, cerebral labor, thinking. So I'm going to suggest to you it's possible that what might be diagnosed as a heart attack in the US is diagnosed instead, it's classified instead as a stroke in Japan. So they would be missing things because of the way they had differently defined things. Before I go on, I want to be clear about what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that omega-3 doesn't protect against heart attacks. I'm just saying, well, we've got two explanations here. Perhaps both of them have a role in this curious anomaly at the top. And we can explore it in a bit more detail. If my bottom line there is right, we might expect strokes to be a higher proportion of strokes in Japan, the rate of strokes in Japan to be greater than that in the US. And in fact, the numbers support that. So maybe there is something to this alternative explanation I'm putting forward, or this additional explanation I'm putting forward. And it's all to do with how you define things and the way that leads to misunderstanding of what's going on, dark data. Now, sometimes dark data are obvious. I have a little actuarial example which I thought would be appropriate to show you today. It's from the Actuary edition of July 2006. You can check it if you like. It included an editorial which said, a couple of months ago, I invited all 16,000 of you to participate in our online survey concerning the sex of actuarial offspring. And then it went on to say, well, I'm pleased to say that a number of you, 13 in fact, replied to our poll. Not 13,000, just 13. On the basis of this, the editor didn't go ahead, and I'm pleased to say didn't go ahead and do an analysis, ignoring the fact that practically all of the data is missing. Actually, that's not quite true. They did do an analysis, but their one conclusion from the analysis is that actuaries tend not to reply to online polls. So let's move on. My book gives a taxonomy of 15 types of dark data. And I have to say that during the COVID pandemic, all of these types occurred. I'm going to run through them very quickly just to illustrate in a moment. And we learned about them as the pandemic progressed. So, we would collect data, and perhaps afterwards we would realize that our conclusions drawn from the data we'd collected were misleading because we'd omitted something crucial. And you may already be able to think of examples of how that happened, but I'm going to illustrate a few. But even so, we have now to ask, okay, so we've got conclusions, we realized we were missing something, we filled it in and drew fresh conclusions. But what else are we missing? There may be other things we've missed. So here are my 15 types. The first two, actually, we're familiar to you. They're similar to Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. The first data we know are missing. In the COVID pandemic, it would have been situations where no formal diagnosis was recorded. We think they've got COVID, but we can't be sure. Then the second is data we don't know are missing. And this, of course, an example of that would be undiagnosed and unrecognized cases. My yellow boxes are just examples of these different types. You may well be able to think of other and indeed better examples. Then, of course, we might be choosing just some cases. I can remember some figures appearing early on in the pandemic, which were based purely on hospital admissions. Well, clearly, that's grossly distorted. A special case of that is self-selection. People who themselves choose to go to a doctor, for example. A sort of orthogonal kind of type is when entire variables are missing. You will remember early on in the pandemic, there were discussions about whether age, ethnicity, sex, and so on had an effect, what effect it had on death rates and mortality rates and so on. Missing variables. Let me give you a little example of this and how it can be particularly confusing and misleading. So I'm going to go back to this date early on. Early on in the pandemic, and I'm looking at the death rate, number of dead amongst number of people aged 60 plus, number of cases aged 60 plus. What's the death rate amongst the people with COVID aged 60 or more? And I'm contrasting Italy and China. And there are the two death rates. Italy had a worse death rate than China. Okay, so now let's look at the decades between 60 and above. So the first decade, 60 to 69, we see that Italy had a lower death rate. Between 70 and 79, Italy also had a lower death rate. And you probably saw this one coming. Above 79, 80 plus, Italy also had a lower death rate. So we appear to have something of a contradiction here. Overall, Italy's worse, but within each of those age bands, which together add up to all of the age bands, Italy's better. So what's going on here? Now, I guess all of you will immediately recognize this as Simpson's paradox. And the explanation is to do with how we calculate means, weighted averages, and so on. I'm not going to go into that now. What I want to do now is draw your attention to the importance of asking the right question and getting the data you want. If we were government, we might be interested in the top lines of this table, overall measures. But if we were doctors or something like that, we might be interested in classifying by age so that we could focus more specifically on mechanism, if you like. And if you were interested, what you've recorded, what data you have, what variables you have recorded will have a big impact on the questions you can ask, and you could be misled. Let me move on. Data which might have been my sixth type. Well, I guess counterfactuals. You will remember a debate early on in the pandemic. The clinical trials, I think, had all been conducted with a 3-month delay between the first and second vaccination. And then governments realized that if they delayed it to a 6-month gap, they could get more people vaccinated. So there were questions about what would happen. In fact, it turned out to be a good idea, but they didn't know that at the time. They didn't have the data at the time. So they had to decide blind, if you like. What about changes with time more generally? Well, of course, data on one variant might not apply to another. As I said at the start of all these little examples, we learnt about what was going on progressively over time, but at the time when decisions have to be made, you don't know what you're missing, what's crucial. Definitions of data, I've already given you some examples, but I've got a very nice little one. One of my favorite little examples from that date. The UK was reporting 37,000 deaths out of 267,000 cases. Russia was reporting a ninth as many deaths out of 50% more cases. Very different rates. And one of the explanations for this could well be that they were using different definitions of what a case is, with COVID, of COVID, formerly diagnosed COVID, and so on. Or, well, there might be other dark data reasons for these discrepancies. What about summaries of data? Well, I probably don't need to say anything here. We all know that summaries, by definition, hide the details. An average is all very well, but you don't know if it means that everybody's got exactly the same value, or some are much lower and some are much higher. And in the context of COVID, of course, governments like my China-Italy example will proudly tell you what their national death rates are, but we all know that the deaths aren't uniformly spread over the population. Deaths occur in clusters, super spreading events, and so on. What about measurement error and uncertainty? Well, we all know how difficult it is to carry out one of these COVID tests 100% effectively. It's quite uncomfortable. So no wonder we get false positives and false negatives. Politicians, one of the good things about the COVID pandemic was that politicians began to understand something about tests not being perfect. My final 5, feedback and gaming. Well, we're talking about humans here. If you do something to a human or tell a human something, they might well change their behavior. And in the case in point here was people relaxing after a first vaccination. Information asymmetry, people claiming, sorry, my throat seems to, anyway, claiming a vulnerable family member as a reason to stay off work, which people collecting statistics wouldn't know about. Intentionally dark data, fraud, and so on, or governments concealing COVID numbers are not unknown, and I'm sure you can think of examples. Fabricated and synthetic data, well, yeah, obviously, prime example here is anti-vaccine misinformation. And then extrapolating beyond your data. And I referred to long COVID right at the start when I was talking about measles. And there isn't a formal definition of long COVID. So there is a serious risk of extrapolating beyond what we know, what we have data on. So those are the 15 types in my book, if you like. They were all the ones I could think of, the types of dark data, not just applying to COVID. I should say, actually, my book appeared in February 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. So COVID, pandemic are words which don't appear in it. But you could write, as I hope I've illustrated, an entire book on dark data in the pandemic. Anyway, those 15 types are almost certainly not comprehensive. And the reason is that we keep coming up with new kinds of data, new ways of collecting data. So in the last couple of decades, these sorts of new ways of collecting data have arisen. So what's the future going to hold? And obviously, new kinds of data lead to new kinds of dark data. And this is a crucial point. The 15 types or more are not mutually exclusive. Just because you identify, oh, I am missing something crucial from my data set, it's biased, distorted, whatever, doesn't mean you're not also missing other kinds. Okay, let me say something about possible factors in increased pandemic excess death rates. And I would like first to qualify this by saying I am not an expert on this. Some of you will be much more expert, I think. But there are various possible factors. One is, of course, delayed diagnosis, delayed treatment because of lockdowns. The summer heat wave would have had some sort of impact, and indeed did. NHS overstretch, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. Long COVID, I've referred to that. The cost of living crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. People not being able to afford treatments. And perhaps the reversal of a 2020 mortality displacement. By the way, when doctors go on strike, death rates decline, which is something to bear in mind here in these figures. But those are things that I could think of off the top of my head, and possibly things that you know about and have explored in detail. But what have we forgotten? That's the crucial point. What dark data are we missing? Again, interestingly enough, in the Times a week or so ago, this suggestion appeared. Half of all excess death rates last year were caused by patients facing long waits. This article refers to hidden data, if you like, a paraphrase of dark data. And it goes on to suggest that the delays were responsible for nearly half of the 51,000 excess deaths, which of course means that there's another 25,000 not explained by this, but perhaps that's one explanation. We need further explanations. But don't forget this, and I'm going to keep stressing this, different types of dark data can occur together. And I thought this was an interesting set of data. It's from the Office for Health Improvements and Disparities, which used to be Public Health England. It shows you the excess death rates due to non-COVID causes from May last year to January of this year. Just looking at that set, you think, okay, well, how can we explain these death rates? There's something crying out for an explanation. But if you include some data which I haven't got on this graph, what I'm going to do is extend backwards over time. Within the red box is the slide I've just shown you. You see a rather curious structure, which again is crying out and might go on to explain the excess death rates to some extent, things being shifted for some reason that I don't claim to understand. I'm not an expert in this from the beginning first half of the year to the second half, but some of you might tell me about this. Okay, now lots of my examples so far have been, well, for example, to do with the pandemic and involve large data sets. But this is a problem which is not just due to large data sets, which you can't examine in detail. And I'm going to give you a final non-COVID example. You may recognize this. This is the Challenger space shuttle before it was launched in 1986, January. What happened was, and some of you will, possibly all of you will recall this, it was launched on that date, and 73 seconds into the launch, 9 miles high, it blew up. The crew compartment carried on in a ballistic trajectory to a height of 12 miles and then fell into the ocean, killing all 7 astronauts. So 7 fatalities. But this is a small data set. It also involves 7 data points. So 7 fatalities and 7 data points. Now, if you have come across this before, you'll all know the explanation. The 2 booster rockets on the side of the big brown fuel tank come in segments. And between each of the segments, there is a sort of rubbery seal called an O-ring, which stops fuel and things leaking out from there. And it was known that these O-rings, these seals, became less malleable in cold weather. And the forecast temperature for the launch the next day was that the temperature was going to be very low. So they held a teleconference. The people who built this thing held a teleconference to decide whether to go ahead. And at that teleconference, they saw this graph. This graph was presented. I've got temperature along the horizontal axis. Each dot represents one shuttle launch, previous shuttle launch. temperature along the horizontal axis, and the number of O-rings, the number of these seals in that launch which had problems. So at the lowest previous temperature launch, which was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 of the O-rings had a problem. But on the other hand, at the highest temperature previous launch, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 of the O-rings had a problem. All of the others had 1 problem. Now, if I was talking to my students at this point, I would say there's something funny about this graph. There's nothing wrong with it, but looking at it might raise some suspicions. And I would pause there, but I don't have time to pause now, so I'm going to tell you what suspicions you've probably already thought of. What this appears to show is that none of the previous launches had no O-rings experiencing a problem. They all had 1 or more. You might have expected the dot down here just by random variation. Not necessarily, but you might have expected it. In fact, if you knew how many previous shuttle launches there had been, you would know that there were things, dots, missing from this graph. Nevertheless, this is the graph that the teleconference was presented. And on the basis of that, they decided that the relationship between number of O-ring problems and air temperature was not very dramatic. Certainly the lowest temperature had the highest number of O-rings, but the second highest was the highest temperature. So, you know, the slope of the relationship is not very dramatic. But as I said, they're missing information on previous launches, the ones which had no problems. Let's include those. Here they are. Now, this gives a completely different picture to what's going on. It's very clear that lower temperatures are likely to have more problems, higher temperatures less. In fact, if I draw a vertical line at 65 degrees Fahrenheit down here, you'll find that all of the previous launches below that had problems. A very low proportion of the ones above that temperature had problems. And if you were to fit a line through that, it would have a very pronounced negative slope. If I then go on to tell you what the forecast temperature was for the next day, the day of the launch, it was there, you might well have decided not to go ahead with that launch. So crucial missing dark data from this example. Just 7 data points leading to 7 fatalities. Okay, so I'm going to wind up now. Again, I stress this point that just because you've identified one particular kind of missing data doesn't mean that there might be others, doesn't mean there might not be others, that the different kinds can work together. They can sort of synergize each other into a sort of diabolical synergy. My book, I presented the problems in this very brief talk because I want to alarm you and make you rush out to buy the book, of course. But the book also explores how you detect dark data, what you do about it, and goes beyond that and tells you how to take advantage of dark data. We all do this already in some ways, which maybe I'll talk about in a moment, but you can go beyond that. And I want to finish with another little anecdote. I started with the elephant powder man, and I want to finish with another little anecdote that you'll all again be familiar with, the drunken lamppost. You come across this guy, he's leaning against a lamppost, staring at the ground. It's at night. And you say to him, "Have you lost something?" And he says, "Yes, I've lost my wallet." And you look around and you can't see it. You say, "You dropped it here?" He said, "No, I dropped it over there." And he points out into the darkness. But it's dark over there. I can't see what's going on over there, so I'm looking here. And I'm suggesting to you that if you just look at the data you've got and don't think about possible dark data, you're behaving like that drunk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was a very insightful and very interesting presentation with some fantastic examples. Lots of great food for thought there. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions you'd like to ask, please post them in the chat and we'll address those as we go through. But perhaps just to get things going, if I could pick up at the end of that presentation where you mentioned that there are strategies for dealing with dark data, and if we could maybe pick up on some of the first steps we could take to deal with this issue. Something that is very relevant in the mortality and longevity community at the moment is trying to understand trends and patterns as the data is emerging. I mentioned at the beginning that we're looking at this point of the experience in 2022, which you also have the reference in your chart. And one of the things that struck me is that it really depends when you look at what time period and what comparators that you might have as to see what's going on at a particular segment in time. But are there any other techniques we could employ where you've got this real-time emergence question to try and avoid us leaping to the wrong conclusion just with the most recent data point?
I think, I think there's a sort of general overriding thing here, which is one should always be skeptical, if you like. You collect the data, you see the data, and it's always very tempting, and I've fallen into this temptation myself, of, great, I'll rush in and analyze it, because that's the fun part. But just as, one spends 90% of one time cleaning data, I think one also needs to spend a significant amount of time being suspicious and saying, what might I be missing? What things are, what crucial things am I omitting? It's sort of like a more general point, really. In science, you never have the right answer, in the sense you have the best answer so far in terms of the data you've got, but that doesn't mean it might not change as more data are collected or as other theories come along. The question about emerging data is gradually accumulating data is a very good one and a very tough one. But I don't think there's anything different about that from sort of retrospectively looking at already existing data sets, except for the time urgency and the sort of temptation to rush ahead with an analysis as it's coming in. I just think one just has to exert extra caution.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. I think that for me was the message that really came through very strongly in what you were saying, is it's stop and think.
Stop and think. That's exactly right. Yeah. And of course, one can formalize that. One can set up red teams and so on. If you're working in a sort of corporate environment, you can say, right, we come up with this. We think it's like this. We think we have all the data which we need to explain the phenomenon. Pick holes in it. That sort of thing. And it's a good idea, because you know how it is. One gets wedded to one's. I found this wonderful structure in the data, and I can explain it. And I'm, not. That's my baby, as it were. So I'm not going. And so you need perhaps fresh eyes to look at it, to criticise it.
Absolutely. I've even seen examples where people get given a formal role and it rotates. So it's a different person of the same group every time to overcome the maybe the social discomfort with being the one to disagree very strongly. So you have a rotating position on the committee whose job it is to be the counter argument, in a sense.
I think that's a really good idea. Yeah. And I do think that formalising it in that way overcomes social inertia and social hesitation and so on.
Yeah. But it's always maybe it's another reminder to people to be bold in seeking out contrary opinions, and try and avoid the old confirmation bias, because.
Yes. I talk about confirmation bias in the book. Absolutely, very important to try to avoid it. But because we're human, very difficult. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we can only come up with strategies like the example of having someone whose job it is to be the counter arguer, and do the best we can. Going in a slightly different direction, I suppose one of the other things when you're looking at something and you've come up with an explanation, it's easy to then stop, perhaps, and we might think, just tying back to the example of mortality experience, where there's a lot of focus on pressures on the NHS and hospital care and acute emergency treatments and waiting times at accident and emergency and so on. But perhaps there are other factors that are themselves leading to that. So we know there are issues with challenges in social care, for example, which mean that people are not being discharged from hospital even though they're fit to do so, and that then contributes to some of the backlog issues. And I wondered whether perhaps thinking about those secondary effects or underlying causes as dark data might help us to come up with a better analysis. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a very nice question. I think yeah. Maybe I'll talk more about this in a moment in a different sort of context. But coming up with deeper explanations for what's going on does mean that you are less likely to be misled by dark data, I think. So that's especially valuable. I think it also will depend upon exactly what question you're trying to answer. At one level, you might be satisfied with an explanation that excess mortality is caused by NHS stress or something like that. A scientist or a medic might be satisfied, or a hospital administrator might, but at a deeper level, a politician might now be interested in what's causing the NHS stress and try to solve that. So I think it probably depends at what level, what data are relevant to your question depends what your question is, I suppose, is a summary of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So almost, sorry, understanding what you want to answer and what you want to do with the result is an important way of deciding.
I have to sort of say also in this context, in a sense, we're talking about causal mechanisms here, and not all of the, obviously particularly pertinent in the pandemic situation, but sometimes you're not interested in causes, but work on understanding causal modeling in general. There's been a lot of work on that over the last couple of decades, some very impressive work by people like Judah Pearl, Jamie Robbins, and so on. A lot of deep understanding and advances have been made. But whether it's relevant, again, depends on what question you're trying to answer.
Absolutely. We've had a question through from the audience that I think is worth just bringing in now, which is asking about, are there any ways of visualizing the data or presenting the data that might help us? So that going back to your example of the Challenger incident, and that if you had included the dark data in the chart, it would have given you a very different picture, and that was quite stark. Do you think that, is there a general approach that we could use, or is that very specific to that particular example?
Yeah, I've never been asked this question before. I don't think, the question says, are there particular ways? And I think, yes, there are particular ways. I'm not sure that there are general ways. I'm going to try, if I can, to bring up some other slides which will illustrate particular plots which enable you to spot dark data. Let me see if I can. No, there. Share. And then. Okay. Can you see my slide again? It just says basic strategy at the moment.
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. All right. I won't talk. Oh, yes. This is what I wanted to talk about. I'm talking about particular ways, depending upon what question you're trying to answer and what sort of data you're looking at. This is a funnel plot. Some of you will be familiar with that. They're used in clinical trials, in meta-analysis, in fact. On the horizontal axis, it shows the effect size. On the vertical axis, it basically shows sample size, if you like, something analogous to sample size. Each dot represents a clinical trial. And you might expect random variation about the sort of central vertical line. But there seems to be a dearth of points, too few points at the bottom. The lack of symmetry in this particular plot suggests maybe some data are missing. Maybe we're being misled because particular trials didn't get significant results, so they never appeared in the literature, for example. But that's a very particular plot for a very particular kind of dark data. I have another one here, which you may have seen before. This is ambulance response time. It's time on the horizontal axis and number of calls responding in that time on the vertical axis. And it shows this extraordinary peak at 8 minutes. Now, you wouldn't expect that. There's clearly something going on. But my point here is that this particular plot has made it very apparent that you are being misled somehow by what's going on. The ambulances don't sort of race over to the accident, then wait around the corner until it's just 8 minutes and then suddenly turn around the corner. There's something funny going on. And then I have another little plot, again, very different from the others and very particular to the question. This was from a big anti-money laundering project I was involved in with a major investment bank. And it's to do with Benford distributions, which you may well be familiar with. The expected frequency is given by the black bar chart. The orange bar chart shows you the obtained frequency from a set of data is to do with frequencies of first digits, and they're clearly very different. So that doesn't mean that fraud is necessary, money laundering is necessarily going on, but it raises suspicions. But my point about showing you these little plots, 3 little plots, is that they are very specific to the kinds of dark data and the problems you're looking for.
So it's really back to thinking through the specific situation and where it could be going wrong.
Yeah. Having said that, this is a very interesting question, and I should devote some time to thinking about whether there are. I mean, I'm fond of scatter plots, so very basic, simple plots. I'd always start with that if I could apply it in a particular context. But yeah, it's an interesting question. There might be particular ways which have some sort of range of general applicability. I'll think about that. It's a nice question. Thank you.
Perhaps also it's try a variety of different options. So don't just look at, so you've got your one plot that you really like that shows the result that you believe is true. Try something else, try looking at it a different way and see if it gives you a different result.
Absolutely. I used to do a lot of work on data mining, data sets with billions of data points. And I always used to say that, when I was taught statistics, I was taught to look at the data first, exactly as you say, look at it this way, look at it that way, and that is crucial. But of course, you can run into problems when you've got a billion data points because, but there are ways around it, which I won't go into now. But what you just said is spot on. Look at it as many different ways as you can, because you don't know what curious anomaly might be hiding in it. If only you can find the right way, which you might see if only you can find the right way of looking at it. Absolutely.
That was a very interesting point you touched on about the data mining and I guess what we would call big data nowadays, which is becoming an area of a lot of impact in a lot of different areas and focus of a lot of attention and funding and so on. So I wondered, in those big data sets, are they more susceptible to these dark data issues or?
Thank you for asking this question. Yes, I'm really pleased you asked this because what people tend to say is, I'm not vulnerable to these issues because I've got vast amounts of data. I mean, any dark data problems are going to disappear in the wash. This is not true. Big data sets, the way I summarize it is that big data sets have all the problems of small data sets, but special ones of their own, like the difficulty of seeing what's going on, or the fact that any little test you do is going to show up significant because of they have all sorts of problems and might hide data in all sorts of obscure ways you haven't thought of. Bottom line, there are 32 million seconds in a year. So if you examine the records one at a time, it's going to take you 30 years. So that's not going to happen. You need to find ways. You need to project the data down, perhaps into a graphical display, perhaps into a statistical summary. And whenever you do that, you're getting one view of the data. So as you say, get as many different views as you can, but you can't get an infinite number of views. You can't get a view which will reveal all structure in the data. So big data sets carry greater risks. Yeah.
That's very interesting. It sounds like potentially there's a possibility of that being a little bit of a blind spot then for people doing all that. And making people need to make sure that they're particularly aware of that when looking at the results of that sort of analysis.
I think that's absolutely right. There was something else I wanted to come back to, actually. What if we have time in a moment, we might come back to, I very briefly we talked about detecting dark data by looking at plots and so on. I haven't really talked about how you overcome the problem. I haven't talked about how you take advantage of it, which is an interesting sort of flipping things on its head. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk about what's happening in, I was going to say what's happening in the world of data science, but it's really what's happening in the world with machine learning and AI becoming more and more important. You can't open a newspaper or switch on a television without hearing about these things. And this is worrying. And I think we see this with Chat GPT and all sorts of things. There are, well, I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I mean, I think, I'm an enthusiast for data science and all the opportunities it brings us, but these things like any advanced technology, it comes with risks like nuclear technology, biological technology, whatever. And I think there are risks here. And I think one of the fundamental risks is the following. There are two kinds of statistical models. There are those based on theory, maybe based on Newton's laws or something, physics. And there are those based on just observing structures and patterns, features in the data. You notice a correlation, you notice a peak, you notice an anomaly, that sort of thing. And basically the sort of efflorescence of machine learning and AI tools that we're seeing at the moment, which are offering to revolutionize society, are always based on the second type. Not entirely, but mostly based on data-driven models, not theory-driven, but purely based on structures in the data. And those sorts of models are fundamentally brittle. We all know that the world's not stationary. So if you've got lots of data, big data set in the past, you built your model on it, there are these correlations, I'm very sure, and so on. But then the world changes. A financial crash, a pandemic, a war could totally revolutionize things. The structure of what's going on changes. Your model now collapses. It's less likely to do that if it's a theory-based model. So pandemic models are based on deep mathematical theory and biological mechanisms of how diseases are transmitted and so on. They're less vulnerable to this sort of brittleness. But a huge amount of the machine learning and AI work are purely data-driven models and are susceptible to this kind of thing. I've got some examples, actually, which you may well have come across, which illustrate it very easily. There was a system, I can't remember what it's called now, it's in the book, which perfectly distinguished. It was trained to distinguish between edible and poisonous mushrooms. And it learnt it perfectly, 100% right in the laboratory. And then they sent it out into the real world. Disaster. And eventually they discovered this was a dark data problem. The problem was that the system had been trained on data where an edible and a poisonous mushrooms were presented alternately. And it had learned every odd number is edible, every even number is poisonous. 100% right on a test data set, which was also presented in that way. But the dark data meant it was useless. There was another system, a game playing program, where the objective function was not to lose. And this system learnt that it would never lose if it killed itself at an early level of the game, because it's already dead. It can't possibly lose. And there are other classic examples of this kind of thing. The point is that they're fundamentally brittle models based on structures observed in the past, in the data, not on theory. And those data, one of my dark data types was things which change over time. We know that the world is non-stationary. You should expect it to change over time. And those models will run a risk of collapsing.
Yeah. I suppose as well, especially if it is one of these very complex ones, it's very difficult to know exactly what structures it's fitted to and how it's found those and how it's all working. So
absolutely, your deep learning models with billions or even trillions now of parameters. Absolutely, yeah.
So a health warning on those results to everybody, and another plea for caution when you're interpreting results.
Yeah, and exactly, caution and sense check the results. You may be very excited, but you really think that's you really think the donkey can run at 500 miles an hour? What is it?
Yeah. And leading on from that, then, are there any high priority things that you would say to us are the most important for dealing with dark data once you have the suspicion that it's there, and maybe you've got some plots that suggest that there's something going on, and then even taking a step further and taking advantage of it, which I think is a very interesting concept. Most of us would probably think of this as an obstacle that we've got to somehow overcome. And how would you take advantage of something where you've missed out? I think that would be very interesting.
Okay, I've got a couple of slides on that. I think, really, I want people to be moderately alarmed by what I've been saying, because there are risks, there are dangers. However, let's try to do the share screen again. Oops, let's push that one up. Go back to there. Where is it? I can't see it now. try again. For some reason I can't now. Oh yes, there it is. Okay. Okay, let me go down to taking advantage. Aha, here we are. So you should see a slide saying the power of dark data.
Yes, yes, we can see that.
Okay, so I call it the strategic application of ignorance. Now, what we're going to try to do is reveal, structure what's going on in the data by hiding things. And the first little sort of opening example, this will only take a couple of minutes. In 1927, Holland adopted a confidential system of reporting causes of death. And the number of deaths in Amsterdam, which were then attributed to syphilis, increased dramatically. The truth was coming out because of this confidential system. So what they're really doing is making previously invisible data, the true number of deaths due to this cause, we're making that visible by hiding data, the identities of individuals, by making other data invisible. So strategic application of ignorance. And of course, you use these ideas all the time. You use passwords. And the passwords themselves need to be kept dark, of course, but you hide data, the passwords, in order to have to do things. And just one slide which shows that you already probably do these things, but you can flip things on its. Well, this slide you do, 2 slides in, but you can think of familiar ideas in. Flip them on their heads and look at them from the opposite perspective. So sample surveys, the normal ways these are described, and you will have seen them described like this when you were learning about sample service. You take a small percentage of the population, a random sample, proper sample. But you can also think of that as making 90% dark. What about randomized controlled trials? Well, of course, they explicitly hide which treatment is given from the people administering the treatment and so on. So a very graphic kind of dark data. But there's more than that. You can also use the principle of generating dark data, data that could have arisen but didn't, so it's dark data. For example, and I'm sure that many of you do this, you generate multiple data sets using whatever your proposed model is, and that, of course, is just simulation. So you're generating data that could have arisen. It didn't. You didn't see it. It was dark data, but it could have arisen. What about generating extra randomly perturbed copies? So one can regularize or smooth data by jittering it a bit and then analyzing all of these extra copies and the original data together. That's smoothing or regularization. What about taking multiple subsamples of the data? You'll be familiar with that in the context of bootstrap methods. You take a subsample of the data, apply your model to it, do that again and again, generating data that you didn't see but you could have seen. What about in classification methods, diagnostic methods, one way to improve the machine learning system is to find the points it got wrong, generate copies of it, and then rebuild the model on the enhanced data set. This is called boosting. And then, of course, finally, you often will use additional imprecisely specified data. I don't know what the numbers are, but I think I know what the distribution is. And this, of course, is nothing but Bayesian methods with Bayesian priors. So in all of these cases, they're using data you didn't see, but you could have seen, and leading to these very powerful statistical methods. So let me come out of that again.
I think that's a very good point to maybe stop on a very positive note with dark data. It doesn't always have to harm you. There's some very powerful methods that depend upon it, and it's just bearing all of that in mind as you go through your analysis. But thank you very much again, Professor, for your time today. That's been a fascinating overview. I hope it's been very thought-provoking and helpful for our audience. And
very interesting questions. Yes, thank you.
Yes,
yes.
And hopefully that'll help people avoid some of the pitfalls that you can run into if you're not aware of dark data and thinking about it when you're looking at your results. So if there's only one message that you take away from today, is perhaps just stop and think when you see a pattern that looks immediately obvious.
Yeah. And if people want more explanations of what to do about dark data and so on, well, they have to buy the book, I'm afraid.
Yes. And just a quick reminder before we go, recording of this webinar will be available on the Longevity and Mortality Actuaries Member Interest Group website, and there are also recordings of past webinars that we've had, so please do take a look there We also advertise for future webinars as well, so good resource to use. Thank you very much for attending today, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.